3,000 years before the first Christian church was built, God made a covenant with a man. To ratify that covenant, he told the man to cut 5 animals in half and arrange the pieces in 2 rows. The ancient ritual required both parties to walk the bloody corridor between them, each swearing their own life as the price of breaking the agreement. But when the moment came, God put the man into a deep sleep and walked through alone. He took both sides of the oath. He absorbed the full weight of the promise. So who was this man, and what had his life looked like before God called him out of it? To understand why the calling of Abraham matters, you first need to understand what he was leaving behind. The city of Ur sat in southern Mesopotamia, in what is today southeastern Iraq, in the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Ur was not a village. It was a metropolis. At its peak, under the 3rd dynasty of Ur, roughly 2,000 years before Jesus, the population stood at around 65,000 people, placing it among the largest cities anywhere on Earth at that time. The streets of Ur were laid out in organized grids. Houses were multi-story structures built around interior courtyards, with drainage systems, private chapels on the ground floor, and in wealthier homes, 13 or 14 rooms arranged around a central gathering space. Archaeologists have found the remains of scribal schools where children learn mathematics and cuneiform writing on clay tablets. Ur had functioning courts of law, trade guilds, and an economy built on agriculture, textile production, and long-distance commerce stretching from the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan to the coast of the Mediterranean. The plumbing alone would have impressed visitors from Rome 2,000 years later. Homes in Ur had terracotta drainage pipes running beneath the floors. The wealthy had private bathrooms. But the structure that defined everything, the thing visible for miles as you crossed the flat Mesopotamian plain toward the city, was the Great Ziggurat. Picture a massive stepped pyramid rising 70 feet into the air, built from millions of mud bricks, its core reinforced with layers of woven reed matting, its exterior faced in baked brick and bitumen. At the top sat a small temple, and that temple was the house of Nanna, the moon god. Nanna, also known as Sin, was the patron deity of Ur, and the entire city was organized around his worship. The calendar followed lunar cycles. The festivals, the sacrifices, the rhythms of planting and harvesting were all tied to the phases of the moon. The high priestess of Nanna was often the king's own daughter. The temple complex served simultaneously as the city's religious center, its administrative headquarters, and its economic hub. Grain stores, textile workshops, and cattle records were all managed by the temple scribes. To be a citizen of Ur was to be a worshipper of Nanna. There was no gap between civic identity and religious life. They were the same thing. This was the world Abraham was born into. This was what normal looked like. But here is what gets stripped out of most Sunday school versions of the story. Ur was not simply pagan in a theologically abstract sense. It was intellectually advanced in ways that make what God asked of Abraham even more striking. The scribal schools of Ur and the surrounding Sumerian cities had developed a base 60 number system, which is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Sumerian scholars tracked the movements of Venus, predicted lunar eclipses, and mapped constellations with measurable precision. These were not primitive people working by instinct. They were brilliant people building a civilization of extraordinary complexity, and their brilliance was entirely oriented around the worship of the moon. When God called Abraham out of that world, he was not summoning a naive shepherd from an isolated village. He was reaching into the intellectual and spiritual center of human civilization and pulling out a man shaped entirely by it. There is a temptation to imagine Abraham as someone who was already moving toward monotheism before God spoke to him. Perhaps sitting in a courtyard, gazing at the stars, already troubled by the idols around him. That image comes from rabbinic midrash, from later traditions that tell stories of a young Abraham smashing his father's idols and debating the logic of polytheism. Those traditions carry theological meaning, but Genesis itself tells a different story. Joshua 24:2 is direct. It states that Terah, Abraham's father, served other gods. The Hebrew verb used is avad, meaning to serve or to worship. The same verb applied to the Israelites serving Pharaoh in Egypt. Terah was not a casual dabbler. He was devoted, and his son grew up in that devotion. Acts 7 reinforces this when Stephen, in his speech before the Sanhedrin, describes God appearing to Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia before he moved to Haran. The sequence matters. Abraham did not go looking for God. God went looking for Abraham. The initiative was entirely one-sided. This is the first shock of the story. God did not select the most spiritually prepared candidate. He did not find the man who had already worked through his doubts and arrived at a cleaner theology. He chose a man who had grown up worshipping a moon god, the son of an idol worshipper, living in a city built around a religious system with no room for the God who was about to call him. By every visible measure, Abraham was the wrong choice. But that was precisely the point. If God had chosen someone already inclined toward him, already righteous, already seeking, the story would be about human achievement. Abraham would have earned his place through spiritual merit. And the story of Abraham is not about that. It was never about that. The calling of Abraham is about grace, centuries before the word grace became a theological category. To understand how radical this was, you need to look at what the religion of Abraham's world actually looked like in practice. In 1922, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley began excavating the royal tombs of Ur. What he uncovered changed how scholars understand Mesopotamian civilization. The tombs held extraordinary wealth. Gold helmets beaten so thin you could see the detail of every curve, lapis lazuli jewelry imported from mines in what is now Afghanistan, more than 500 miles away, and harps decorated with bulls' heads made of gold and silver. The artistry rivaled Egypt at its finest. But the most disturbing discovery was not the treasure, it was the bodies. In the tomb of Queen Puabi, Woolley found the remains of dozens of attendants, soldiers, musicians and servants, all arranged in orderly rows, apparently having consumed poison and died to accompany their queen. One tomb, known as the Great Death Pit, contained the remains of 74 people, most of them women, dressed in elaborate finery, lying in neat rows as though they had simply lain down and closed their eyes. Woolley found one woman who appeared to have arrived late. A silver hair ribbon was coiled in her pocket, not yet pinned in place. She had come to the ceremony, taken her position among the others, and died before she finished preparing herself. This was ritual mass death. Institutionalized human sacrifice, organized, expected, and woven into the fabric of the religious system Abraham grew up inside. Hold that image, the silver ribbon in the dead woman's pocket. We will come back to it. Genesis 12 verse 1 records the call. 3 Hebrew words, lech lesha. Most English translations render this simply as go or go forth, and that is accurate as far as it goes. But anyone reading Hebrew will tell you that this phrasing is unusual. The word lesh already means go. Adding lecha, a reflexive form, is grammatically unnecessary if the instruction is merely geographical. Scholars have debated the significance of this construction for centuries. The most widely held reading is that lech lecha carries a meaning beyond relocation. It means something closer to go toward yourself, go toward the person I made you to be. Leave behind the identity your culture and your city and your family have built for you, and step into the identity I have for you. God was not simply asking Abraham to change his address. The command also specifies what Abraham must leave, and the structure of the text tightens with each phrase. Leave your land, your birthplace, your father's house. In Hebrew, that sequence moves from the broadest category to the most intimate. Country, then community, then family. Every layer of belonging, every source of identity, security, and status available to a person in the ancient world. In exchange, God offers a promise that, given Abraham's circumstances, borders on absurd. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham is 75 years old. His wife Sarah is barren. He has no children, no heir, no land of his own, and no named destination. God tells him to go to a land that I will show you, not a land whose name or location I will now give you, a land that I will show you. The destination is withheld. That specific detail would have carried a particular weight in the ancient Near East. In that world, gods were understood to be attached to specific territories. To leave your land was to leave the sphere of your god's protection. To travel toward an unnamed place governed by unknown deities was to walk off the edge of the known religious map entirely. Abraham was being asked to trust a voice he had never heard before, promising things he had no way to verify, asking him to go somewhere he had never been, to become something that showed no signs of being possible. Genesis 12:4. So Abram went. He did not ask for a detailed itinerary. He did not negotiate better terms. He did not request a confirming sign before committing. The text records that he heard, and he moved. This will not be the last word on Abraham's character. He will argue with God later. He will laugh at God's promises. He will take matters into his own hands in ways that set off consequences lasting thousands of years. The Bible presents him as a deeply flawed human being who in this particular moment did the one thing that the entire arc of Scripture identifies as foundational to faith. He trusted a word he could not verify from a God he had not grown up worshipping. Hebrews 11:8 describes it plainly. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. Before the word faith became a chapter heading in a theology textbook or a phrase on a car bumper, this is what it looked like. A man in his mid-70s loading up animals in the dark and walking into a desert because a voice told him to. When Abraham arrived in Canaan, the land was already occupied. The Canaanites were there. Abraham was entering someone else's homeland as a foreigner with no legal claim to anything. He would spend the rest of his life as a tent-dwelling nomad in the land God had promised to give him. The single piece of property he would ever legally own in Canaan was a burial plot purchased at full price from the Hittites when Sarah died. At a place called Shechem, near the oak of Moreh, God appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And Abraham built an altar there. That altar is worth sitting with. Abraham has no children, he is old, his wife cannot conceive, the land around him belongs to other people. Nothing about his visible circumstances points toward the fulfillment of the promise, and he builds an altar, not because the evidence supports confidence, but because he has chosen to act as though the promise is real. That is what the Bible means when it uses the word faith. But the very next chapter shows how thin that trust actually is at this stage. A famine hits Canaan. The land God just sent Abraham to cannot feed him, so he heads down to Egypt, and on the way, he says something to his wife Sarah that reveals how fragile his confidence is. He tells her that the Egyptians will notice how beautiful she is, and that they will kill him in order to take her. His solution is for Sarah to identify herself as his sister rather than his wife. Think carefully about what happens here. The man who obeyed God's call and walked away from is now constructing a deception to protect himself. He is effectively placing his wife in another man's household, allowing Pharaoh's court to believe she is available because he is afraid. Pharaoh takes Sarah in. Abraham, because of the lie, receives sheep, cattle, donkeys, and servants. He profits from the deception. Then God sends plagues on Pharaoh's household, and Pharaoh works out what has happened. He summons Abraham and asks him, with what can only be described as justified contempt, why Abraham never mentioned that Sarah was his wife. Then he says, "Take her and go." A pagan king is delivering a moral lecture to the man God chose to bless the nations. Genesis does not soften this. It places it right there, within a few verses of the Great Calling, fully exposing the gap between the Abraham who obeyed and the Abraham who lied. He stumbled almost immediately. He chose self-preservation over trust. But God does not walk away. God rescues Sarah, protects the covenant, and continues. The promise does not collapse under Abraham's failure because the covenant was never built on Abraham's reliability. It was built on God's character. That distinction reshapes how you read everything that follows. Abraham's nephew Lot has traveled with him from Haran. Both men have accumulated enough livestock and staff that the land cannot sustain them together, and their herdsmen are in open conflict. Abraham gives Lot first choice of territory, an act of genuine generosity. Lot looks east toward the Jordan plain, which the text describes as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of God. He takes it. He pitches his tents near Sodom. Abraham remains in the hills of Canaan, the harder land, the drier land, the promised land. Lot chose by sight. He assessed the terrain and took what looked best. Abraham had been called to walk in a different direction entirely, following a promise rather than a landscape survey. The man who walks by faith ends up with the promise. The man who chooses by sight ends up near Sodom. What happens next in Abraham's story almost never makes it into sermons or children's books. Genesis 14 opens with a war. A coalition of 4 eastern kings, led by Chedorlaomer of Elam, has dominated the cities of the Jordan plain for 12 years. In the 13th year, those cities rebel. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and his allies sweep through the region, crushing every opposing force: the Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Emim, and finally, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in the valley of Siddim. The victorious kings loot both cities and take captives. Among those captives is Lot. When Abraham hears this, he gathers 318 trained warriors from within his own household and pursues a coalition that has just defeated multiple armies across an entire region. This detail is important. Abraham is not simply a spiritual figure or a wandering contemplative. He is the head of a wealthy desert chieftain's household with a standing military force. He chases Chedorlaomer's coalition all the way north to Dan, roughly 150 miles. He divides his men, attacks at night, and routs 4 kings and their combined armies. He recovers all the captives and possessions taken from Sodom, including Lot. This is the same man who lied about his wife because he was afraid of Pharaoh. Faith does not travel in a straight line. Abraham is capable of extraordinary courage on one occasion and profound fear on another, and the Bible records both without trying to reconcile them into a tidy portrait. The point was never that Abraham was consistent. The point was that God was. On the way back from that battle, Abraham has one of the most theologically dense encounters in all of Scripture, Genesis 14:18. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. The name Melchizedek means king of righteousness in Hebrew. Salem is an ancient name for Jerusalem, derived from the word for peace. So his full title effectively reads King of Righteousness, King of Peace. He appears without genealogy, without origin story, without any explanation of how a priest of God Most High could exist in Canaan before the covenant, before Israel, before any of the structures of biblical religion have been established. He simply arrives, blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives him 1/10 of everything. Then the king of Sodom steps forward and offers Abraham all the recovered plunder. "Keep everything, you won it." Abraham refuses. He tells the king that he has sworn to God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that he will not take even a thread or a sandal strap from Sodom. He does not want anyone to say that the king of Sodom made Abraham wealthy. Compare this to Egypt. In Egypt, Abraham got rich off a lie about his wife and said nothing. Here, after an actual military victory that entitled him to legitimate spoils, he refuses everything. He has learned something from the earlier disaster. The encounter with Melchizedek confirmed something about the nature of the God he is following, and Abraham is beginning to act like a man who understands that his wealth comes from God, not from kings. But the hardest part of the journey was still ahead, because now came the waiting. Genesis 15 is one of the most strange and profound passages in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. Some time has passed since Abraham arrived in Canaan. He has won a war. He has met Melchizedek. He has refused the king of Sodom's offer. By external measures, he is doing well. But the one thing that would make every promise possible has still not happened. He has no son. In Genesis 15:2, Abraham says what he has apparently been thinking for a long time. He tells God that he remains childless, that the heir of his household is Eliezer of Damascus, his servant. This is not a prayer of gratitude or a declaration of trust. It is a complaint, respectful but direct. God, the great nation you described, still consists of 2 elderly people and a household staff. Years have gone by. Nothing has changed. God takes Abraham outside at night and tells him to look up at the sky and count the stars. Then he says, "So shall your offspring be." Modern people who live anywhere near artificial light cannot fully picture what Abraham saw in that moment. No electric glow for hundreds of miles in any direction, the Milky Way blazing overhead, dense and overwhelming, the sky appearing almost solid with light. And God says, "That is what your descendants will look like." Verse 6 records what happened next. Abraham believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. That single sentence may carry more theological weight than any other in the Hebrew Bible. The Apostle Paul builds his entire theology of justification on it, arguing in both Romans 4 and Galatians 3 that this moment predates the law, predates circumcision, and demonstrates that the basis of right standing before God has always been trust, not performance. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century turned partly on this verse. The entire Christian theology of salvation by grace through faith reaches back to this moment under the stars in Canaan. Abraham believed, and God credited that belief as righteousness, not Abraham's obedience, because he had already disobeyed in Egypt, not his sacrifices because the sacrificial system did not yet exist, not his moral record, his trust. Then Abraham asks God a reasonable follow-up question. How can I know that I will actually possess this land? He wants a guarantee, something binding. God's response is to instruct Abraham to bring a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abraham brings them, cuts the larger animals in half, and arranges the halves in 2 rows, creating a pathway between them. To a contemporary reader, this looks bizarre. To any reader in the ancient Near East, it was immediately recognizable. This is a covenant ratification ceremony. We have archaeological confirmation of this practice from Hittite treaties, texts from the city of Mari, and Assyrian vassal agreements. Jeremiah 34 references the same custom centuries later. A treaty from the ancient city of Alalak, dated to roughly the 18th century BCE, close to Abraham's probable period, describes exactly this arrangement between a vassal king and his overlord. Both parties walk between the animal pieces. Both parties invoke the same curse. May what happened to these animals happen to me if I break this covenant. Walking between the pieces was the most binding oath available in the ancient world. It was a self-curse made visible. Both parties shared the obligation, the risk, and the consequences of failure. So when God tells Abraham to prepare the animals, Abraham knows what comes next. Both of them are going to walk through. Both of them are about to swear with their lives. Except that is not what happens. Genesis 15:12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham, and a dreadful and great darkness came over him. The Hebrew word for that sleep is tardama, the same word used in Genesis 2 when God put Adam into a sleep before creating Eve. This is not ordinary tiredness, this is a divinely imposed unconsciousness, and the emotional texture of the moment is not peaceful. The text says, dreadful and great darkness. The Hebrew word for dreadful is ima, meaning horror or terror. Something is happening that reaches Abraham even through sleep. Then verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. A smoking firepot and a flaming torch. The same imagery that will later appear as the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire leading Israel through the wilderness. This is God himself moving between the pieces. And Abraham is asleep. In the ceremony that requires both parties to walk through and swear their lives, God puts Abraham unconscious and walks through alone. God takes both sides of the oath. God bears both obligations. God is effectively saying, if this covenant is broken by either party, whether by me or by Abraham or by his descendants, let the consequences fall on me. Every other covenant in the ancient Near East distributed the risk between the parties. Here, one party assumes everything. Abraham contributes nothing to the binding of this agreement. He signs nothing. He swears nothing. He is not even awake. The entire covenant rests on God's own faithfulness and God's own willingness to absorb the cost of failure, even failure that is not his own. Between the sleep and the fire, God also tells Abraham what is coming. His descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, servants and afflicted for 400 years. But God will judge the nation that enslaves them, and afterward they will leave with great possessions. This is a preview of Egypt, of the Exodus, compressed into a prophecy delivered to a sleeping man between rows of slaughtered animals. Scholars call this a unilateral covenant, a one-sided unconditional promise. And if you have been paying attention, the foreshadowing is already visible. A God who takes the penalty of covenant breaking onto himself. A God who says, if my people fail, let the punishment fall on me. That thread does not reach its conclusion for another 2,000 years on a hill outside Jerusalem, where a descendant of Abraham bears the full weight of the covenant curse in his own body. But we are not there yet, because before the cross, there is Hagar and Ishmael and the long, painful years when Abraham and Sarah decided to help God along. After Genesis 15, after the stars and the fire and the binding oath, you might expect the story to accelerate. God made a promise. Abraham believed it. Surely now it comes to pass. Instead, years go by. Sarah cannot conceive. Month after month, year after year, the promise remains exactly where it was. Eventually, Sarah proposes a solution. In Genesis 16, she suggests that Abraham take her Egyptian servant Hagar and father a child through her. Before judging this, it helps to understand the cultural context. In the ancient Near East, this was a legally recognized and socially accepted practice. Marriage contracts recovered from Nutsi, an ancient Hurrian city, contain clauses almost identical to what Sarah proposes. The Code of Hammurabi addresses the same arrangement. Abraham was not doing anything scandalous by the standards of his time. He was doing something culturally expected and legally standard. That is precisely the problem. God's promise was never about what human custom could produce. It was specifically about what was humanly impossible. The moment Abraham and Sarah resort to a culturally normal solution, the household falls apart. Hagar conceives, and tension erupts immediately. Sarah, who proposed the arrangement, turns on Hagar and treats her harshly. The Hebrew verb used is ana, the same verb that will later describe how the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites in slavery. Sarah, the future mother of Israel, treats Hagar the way Pharaoh will one day treat Sarah's descendants. The irony is deliberate and sharp. Hagar flees into the desert, pregnant, alone, and enslaved, moving in the direction of Egypt and the only home she had ever known before Abraham's household absorbed her. And then the text does something that catches most readers off guard. God sends an angel to find Hagar. Not Abraham, not Sarah, Hagar, the enslaved Egyptian woman running through the wilderness. The angel finds her at a spring on the way to Shur and tells her to return. But he also gives her something Abraham received, a promise. Her son will be named Ishmael, meaning God hears, and he will become the father of a great people. Hagar's response is unlike anything else in Genesis up to this point. She gives God a name. She calls him El Roi, the God who sees me. A slave woman in the desert names God before Moses, before the prophets, before any formal tradition of divine names has been established. This is not a footnote. This is the text telling you something fundamental about the character of the God who chose Abraham. This God does not only see the elect, he sees the discarded. He sees the woman who was used and expelled and left to find her way back through the desert. Ishmael is born. Abraham is 86 years old. For the next 13 years, he raises this boy and loves him. Then God appears again. Abraham is 99. God establishes the covenant of circumcision, a physical sign carved into the body of every male in Abraham's household on the 8th day of life. In the ancient Near East, other cultures practiced circumcision as a puberty rite or pre-marriage ritual. God takes that existing practice and moves it to infancy, before any capacity for choice or understanding or consent. The sign of the covenant is placed on the body before the person can do anything to earn or deserve it. This mirrors the logic of the covenant in Genesis 15. You did not choose this. You did not earn it. It was placed on you before you could respond to it. God also changes names. Abram becomes Abraham, meaning father of many. Sarai becomes Sarah, meaning princess. And God says Sarah will bear Abraham a son, to be named Isaac. Abraham's response: he fell on his face and laughed. The father of faith, the man whose trust was credited to him as righteousness, collapsed laughing at the promise of God. The Hebrew verb used here is yitzchak, which is the direct root of the name Isaac. Isaac means he laughs. The child is named after the laughter of a father who could not quite believe it was happening. Genesis treats this not as a failure of faith, but as a human response to an overwhelming and improbable promise. Abraham is 99 years old. Sarah is 89. Of course, he laughed. He also says something revealing. He asks whether Ishmael might simply be the one through whom the covenant continues. God, I already have a son. Can we work with that? God says no. Sarah will bear a son. His name will be Isaac, and the covenant will run through him. Not Ishmael, though Ishmael will also be blessed and become a great people. This moment deserves more weight than it usually receives. Abraham has loved Ishmael for 13 years. He raised this child, invested in this child, almost certainly believed at some point that this was the son God had in mind. And now God is telling him that the plan he and Sarah improvised on their own is not the plan. It never was. Then comes the encounter at the Oaks of Mamre in Genesis 18. 3 visitors arrive at Abraham's tent. He responds with the extreme hospitality that was the highest social virtue in ancient Near Eastern culture. He runs to prepare food, asks Sarah to bake bread from fine flour, selects a tender calf, and sets a meal before them. During this visit, God tells Abraham that within a year, Sarah will have a son. Sarah is listening from inside the tent. She laughs to herself, and God says, "Is anything too hard for God?" Sarah panics and denies laughing. God says, "No, you did laugh." There is a gentleness in this exchange that gets lost when it is read too quickly. The whole family has laughed at this promise at one point or another. God names the child after it. The laughter is not punished. It is incorporated. Then the conversation shifts in an unexpected direction. God tells Abraham that he is about to investigate Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin has become severe. And Abraham does something no one else in Genesis has done at this point. He argues. He draws near and asks whether God will truly sweep away the righteous along with the wicked. What if there are 50 righteous people in Sodom, then 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10? Each time God agrees. If 10 righteous people can be found in the city, God will not destroy it. This scene is extraordinary on two levels. First, Abraham is interceding for a city that is not his people, from which he has no obligation to protect, simply because his nephew lives there and because he has developed a conviction about the character of a God who judges the earth. He believes God's justice must be real justice, and he says so directly. Second, Abraham is challenging God, respectfully but without flinching, and God does not punish him for it. The text implies the conversation is welcome, but Abraham stops at 10. He does not ask, what if there are 5? What if there is 1 and there are not even 10? Sodom is destroyed. Only Lot and his daughters escape. Lot's wife looks back at the city as they flee and becomes a pillar of salt. The image of a person unable to leave behind what they have been called away from runs through the whole story. Abraham walked out of Ur without looking back. Lot's wife could not do the same with Sodom. Then, finally, Isaac is born. Genesis 21. Abraham is 100 years old. Sarah is 90. The impossible happens. The child whose name means laughter is born to parents who both laughed at the idea that he could exist. Sarah says, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." For the first time in the Abraham story, there is uncomplicated joy, but it does not last. As Isaac grows, the tension between Sarah and Hagar sharpens. Sarah sees Ishmael, now a teenager, with Isaac, and tells Abraham to send Hagar and her son away. The text says, "This was very displeasing to Abraham." The Hebrew phrase is "vayera meod," meaning it was very evil in his eyes. Ishmael is his son. He has raised him, and now he is being told to send this boy into the desert. God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah, but also promises again that Ishmael will become a nation, because he too is Abraham's offspring. Abraham rises early the next morning. He packs bread and a skin of water himself. He places them on Hagar's shoulder. He sends them away. Read those details carefully. He rises early. He prepares the supplies himself. He puts them on her shoulder. Every phrase points toward a man doing something that is breaking him, doing it anyway, because he has decided to trust God with the outcome. Hagar wanders into the wilderness of Beersheba. The water runs out. She places Ishmael under a bush because she cannot watch him die. She sits at a distance, a bow shot away, and weeps. God hears the boy's voice. The angel of God calls to Hagar from heaven and tells her not to be afraid. "Lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." God opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well of water. El Roi, the God who sees. He sees her again. He sees the boy again. He provides water in the desert the same way he will one day provide water from a rock for the Israelites in Sinai. Ishmael survives. He grows up in the wilderness of Paran. He becomes an archer. His mother finds him a wife from Egypt, and from him Islamic tradition traces a line directly to the Prophet Muhammad. One family's pain, 2 civilizations, 4,000 years of consequences still unfolding. And now God has one final thing to ask of Abraham. Genesis 22 is the most analyzed, most debated, most agonized over chapter in the Hebrew Bible. Kierkegaard wrote an entire book about it. Jewish scholars have spent millennia in conversation with it. Christian theologians read it as the key that unlocks the New Testament. Islamic tradition honors it as one of the greatest acts of submission in human history. And the reason it still haunts readers is because, on the surface, it looks like the very thing Abraham left behind in Ur. Remember the royal tombs. Remember the silver hair ribbon in the dead woman's pocket. Remember that the world Abraham was born into was one where the gods demanded human life. Genesis 22:2. God says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." The Hebrew does not rush this. Your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac. Each phrase narrows the instruction tighter than the one before. And notice that God says your only son, even though Ishmael is alive. Isaac is not Abraham's only biological child. He is the only son of the covenant, the one through whom the entire future hangs. God is naming the cost with precise deliberateness. Genesis 22:3. Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. He rose early, the same phrase that appeared when he sent Hagar away. Abraham's hardest moments begin at dawn. He did not delay. He did not argue the way he argued over Sodom. He did not negotiate. He did not laugh. He got up, prepared what was needed, and started walking. 3 days of travel from Beersheba to the mountains of Moriah. 3 days walking beside his son, knowing what he believed God had asked of him. 3 days of silence, of whatever was happening in the interior life of this man that the text does not describe. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the place from a distance. He told his servants to stay with the donkey. He said, "I and the boy will go over there and worship, and we will come back to you. We will come back to you, both of us." The author of Hebrews interprets this moment in chapter 11. He writes that Abraham reasoned that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead. Abraham had decided to obey, but he had also concluded, somehow against every visible logic, that God would find a way to keep the covenant. Because if Isaac died, the promise died. And Abraham had seen enough of this God to believe that the promise would not die. Then Isaac speaks. "Father," he says, "here are the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac is not a small child at this point. Most scholars estimate he was somewhere between his early teens and his mid-20s, old enough to carry the wood up the mountain, old enough to understand the requirements of a burnt offering, and old enough to notice that something essential was missing. Abraham answers with a sentence that carries more weight than it appears to hold. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. In Hebrew, this sentence is grammatically ambiguous in a way that seems intentional. It can mean God will provide the lamb for himself, or it can mean God will provide himself as the lamb. The structure allows both readings, and if you are reading this text as a Christian, that ambiguity does not feel accidental. They reach the summit. Abraham builds the altar. He arranges the wood. He binds Isaac and places him on top. And here is a detail that deserves attention. Isaac lets himself be bound. He is almost certainly stronger than his 100-and-some-year-old father. He could have resisted. He could have run. He chose not to. Jewish tradition has always emphasized this point. The Akedah, the binding, is not only a test of Abraham's obedience, it is also a test of Isaac's willingness. Father and son are both choosing together in this moment. Abraham reaches out and takes the knife. Then the angel of God calls from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." In Scripture, when God addresses someone by name twice, it signals both urgency and intimacy. Abraham answers immediately, "Here I am." The angel says, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looks up. Caught in a thicket by its horns is a ram. He takes it and offers it as the burnt offering in place of his son. And he calls the place Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. The text adds, "As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided." The geography here becomes theology. 2 Chronicles 3:1 identifies Mount Moriah as the location where Solomon later built the temple in Jerusalem. The mountain where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac is the same mountain where Israel would offer sacrifices for centuries. And for Christians, it is the same mountain complex where Jesus of Nazareth, a direct descendant of Abraham through the line of Isaac, was crucified. Abraham called the place the Lord will provide. And the text says, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided," future tense. Something is coming. Something will happen on this mountain that will fulfill what this moment was pointing toward. The ram caught in the thicket dies in place of the son. An innocent animal substituted for the one who was supposed to die. That principle, one life offered in place of another, becomes the central logic of Israel's entire sacrificial system. And for Christians, it becomes the interpretive key to the death of Jesus. So why did God ask Abraham to do this? The test was not really about whether Abraham was willing to kill. God stopped the sacrifice before the knife fell. God never intended for Isaac to die. The question being asked was a different one. Abraham, is there anything you love more than me? Remember where Abraham came from. He walked out of a city of idols. But the pull toward idolatry does not disappear when you change geography. Isaac was the miracle, the impossible son, the living proof that God's word was real. Isaac was the embodiment of every promise Abraham had waited 25 years to see fulfilled. And when the gift starts to matter more than the one who gave it, when the blessing edges out the God who blessed, when your identity becomes anchored in what you have received rather than in the one who gave it, you have constructed a new idol out of something God gave you. God was not asking Abraham to become something monstrous. God was asking Abraham to answer the question with something other than words. And Abraham answered. After Moriah, the next major event is the death of Sarah. Genesis 23. Sarah dies at the age of 127 in Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham comes to mourn for her and to weep. The Hebrew uses two distinct verbs, lispod, meaning to eulogize or lament formally, and livkot, meaning to weep privately. Public mourning and personal grief. Abraham does both. Then he does something characteristically practical. He negotiates with the Hittites to buy a burial plot, the Cave of Machpelah. Genesis 23 records this transaction in more detail than almost any other commercial exchange in the Bible. Abraham approaches the sons of Heth and identifies himself as a stranger and a sojourner, a resident alien with no inherent legal claim. He is to buy a burial site. Ephron names a price of 400 shekels of silver. Abraham weighs out the silver and pays it. This is the only piece of the promised land Abraham ever owns. After decades of wandering, after altars built at Shechem and Bethel and Hebron, after a covenant in which God promised him the entire land. Abraham's sole real estate transaction in Canaan is a cemetery. He buries Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. And when Abraham himself dies, Genesis 25:9 records that his sons Isaac and Ishmael bury him there beside her. Isaac and Ishmael, together at their father's grave. That detail, quiet and almost easy to miss, is one of the most striking lines in all of Genesis. The son of the covenant and the son who was sent away, the one who remained and the one who was cast out. They stood beside each other and buried their father together. Whatever the years had done to Ishmael, whatever the desert had been, he came back for the funeral. He stood with his brother. Abraham died at 175 years old, owning exactly one parcel of land in the country God had promised him. And that parcel was a tomb. The man told his descendants would be as numerous as the stars died without seeing a single one of them become a nation. And yet the text says he died in a good old age, an old man and full of years. The Hebrew word for full there is sava, meaning satisfied, content, complete. Not because he had received everything he was promised, because he had walked with the God who promised it. He never saw Israel. He never saw the temple on Moriah. He never saw David or Solomon or the prophets. He never saw a young woman in Nazareth told by an angel that she would carry the Son of God, and answering, "Let it be to me according to your word." He never saw any of it. But the covenant he carried when he walked out of Ur was already in motion. From Abraham to Moses, from Moses to David, from David to the prophets, from the prophets to Bethlehem. And 2,000 years after Abraham called a mountain the Lord will provide, on that same mountain complex, a man who called himself the Good Shepherd said, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord, the Lamb God provided." The covenant God sealed in the dark, walking through blood alone while Abraham slept, taking both sides of the oath, bearing the cost of every failure that would follow. It was always heading here. From the first word spoken to an old man in a pagan city built around a ziggurat, from the first step taken into an unnamed land, from the first star counted under a Mesopotamian sky. 4,000 years ago, a man loaded up his animals in the dark and walked into the desert because a voice told him to. And the world has never looked the same since.